I may have mentioned before that if a parent reads to his or her child, but reads something that is of interest to the parent, that the parent is familiar with. If the parent is a doctor, it might be something having to do with recent medical discoveries or something of that nature. The toddler is going to learn more vocabulary and is going to be more engaged with that than if the parent reads a story that the parent is not very interested in. To some extent, their interest in the subject matter, their enthusiasm for the subject matter is transmitted to the child, and the learning opportunity is enhanced. In the same way, in our learning, if we can be engaged with, emotionally connected to what we're doing, we're going to have more success. Now, it turns out that this ability to engage with what we're doing, or the importance of this sort of emotional attachment, increases as we grow older. And this is based on research. It's some of the things that I've been reading in Manfred Spitzer's recent book on learning. What happens is that as the plasticity declines, to compensate for that, there is a growth throughout adulthood of myelin, I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, which is this white matter that protects some of the pathways in our brain and speeds up the connection between different parts of the brain, left side of the brain, right side of the brain, parts of the brain that are more involved with, say, music as opposed to logic, so that there's more of a comprehensive approach to the functioning of the brain. It also improves our impulse control as we have more sort of a developed value system. And studies, research on the brain have shown that our value system kicks in before comprehension kicks in. We react to our value system faster than we understand things. And we can see this sometimes in discussions. You don't understand what the other person is saying, but you react, you fly off the handle because of something that's based on your value system. So all of this is to talk about the importance of engagement in the sense of engaging different parts of our brain and engaging yourself with the content that you are learning and with the learning process itself. Spitzer mentions the curious example of research that was done in a wine store in Germany. If they play German music, the customer is more likely to buy German wine. If they play French music, the customer is more likely to buy French wine. So there is this influence of different parts of our brain and our emotions on our decision making and probably on our learning. I guess too that it sort of relates to dopamine. There's this dopamine in anticipation of an activity, and there is dopamine after the reward. And these are some of the things that we need to engage for successful language learning. Now, I'm assuming that most people who follow me are independent language learners, whether they are in a classroom or not, but they're nevertheless independently motivated to learn. So there is a level of motivation, the start of engagement. How do we make sure that that engagement can be reinforced or at least maintained during the process of learning? So let's first look at content. Obviously, we should be engaging with content that is engaging. So at the very early stages in learning a language, this can be relatively uninteresting content with a high degree of repetition, because our curiosity about the language, our sense of reward when we start to understand certain things or start to be able to say certain things, that will carry us forward. But there comes a point where we need to select material that we like, where we like the voice, where maybe there's musical background, it's a subject matter that we enjoy, it's at a speed that we can understand. Everything about our engagement with that bit of content is rewarding, and that will maintain our engagement with the content. And if we are engaged with the content, we will learn. Part of this sort of engagement with content is varying the content you listen to, staying with a particular subject matter for a while, where you have some domain knowledge, which is, again, helps with engagement. Or if you're curious about a new area where you have less domain knowledge, nevertheless, you can be motivated by this desire to learn new things. So that's another form of engagement. You want to vary what you're listening to. You may want to go back to some of the earlier beginner material because you're motivated to review certain structures in the language. All of this is ensuring that you have a high level of engagement with the content. In that regard, we live in a world where it's easy to find engaging content, where it's easy to find content that's more similar to the parent reading something of interest to the parent. So it might be a podcast in your target language on cooking or on politics or on a subject of interest. And all of that is going to be more engaging than listening to something narrated by someone that was a text from a language learning book, which typically those kinds of recordings are rather uninteresting and don't spark a high degree of engagement. So the second issue is grammar. People have varying degrees of tolerance or interest in grammar. I can only speak of my own experience, and that is that I have a certain amount of tolerance for seeing some aspects of the structure or the grammar of a new language explained up front, but I have no expectation that I'm going to be able to remember that or certainly not apply that. However, after exposing myself to a fair amount of content in the language, I do find it engaging to go back and review some explanations and some rules of grammar to confirm some of the things that I have noticed in the language. And in doing so, there are always things that I never noticed. And every time I go back, I'll find some new things that I haven't yet noticed in the language. I'm vaguely aware of, and when it's pointed out to me, I'm more aware of those things. That's a form of engagement with grammar that I find interesting. On the other hand, I'm not interested in drills, quizzes, tests. I find I'm not at all interested in sort of evaluation and measurement, which seem to be sort of important parts of language instruction in the formal in the school system, but which I find discouraging. I know I get things wrong. I don't need to have it pointed out to me. I'm not interested in trying to fill in the blanks or remember things. So those are not things that increase my level of engagement. Third of all, in terms of vocabulary, again, we can enhance our level of engagement, and I do that by making my sort of interesting input activities my predominant way of accumulating vocabulary. So I'm always engaged with content of interest, which I explained earlier, what constitutes content of interest to me, and I am confident. And, being confident about the process is an important part of engagement. So I am confident that listening and reading and encountering the same words, which on link have changed from blue to yellow, that gradually these words will form part of my passive vocabulary, and eventually some of them will form part of my active vocabulary. On the other hand, I find that doing flashcards doesn't engage me at all. I find it boring, uninteresting. I will sometimes look at 2 or 3 words, a small number of words, right after having encountered them in a sentence, say, while reviewing new content, difficult content at link. But beyond that, I won't. I won't go to a long stack of hundreds of words and try to go through them in the hope that somehow some of this is going to stick. I don't find it that engaging. And if it's not engaging, I don't believe eventually I'm going to learn from that process. It's interesting, by the way, that research shows that once we get past the high frequency words in a language, the frequency with which we meet a word, and you can, of course, increase that frequency by doing flashcards, that frequency is less important than meeting those same words in a variety of different contexts. This is particularly true of low frequency words and of verbs, where the connection of those words with other words in a variety of different contexts contributes more to us acquiring those words than the simple fact of how frequently we come across them. So number 4 is pronunciation. Again, when trying to pronounce the language, we have to engage with the language, with the culture. We're imitating the culture. We have to be willing to let go of whatever our native language is or languages that we speak well, and we have to engage with the new language. I have said before, it's difficult for me, having studied Spanish, first to throw myself into, to engage completely with Portuguese pronunciation, because the Spanish pronunciation tends to take over. So it's difficult for me to detach myself. I've also mentioned the example of, say, athletes who play sports in North America. Very quickly, they're engaged with their teammates. They start speaking with ease, with a relatively good level of pronunciation, whereas, say, a professor at the university from, some country, a foreign country, will be less able to kind of engage with the community that surrounds him or her, and will have more difficulty coming up with a comfortable level of pronunciation. Not always the case, by no means, a bit of a generalization, but I use it to illustrate the importance of engagement in improving our pronunciation. Fifth, when it comes to output speaking, again, if we can engage in meaningful conversations on subjects of interest to us, we are going to learn more from that than the sort of role-playing or eikaiwa in Japan, where students sit around and talk to each other with a limited sort of range of vocabulary on subjects that are not of any great interest to any of them. Similarly, with my tutors online, if I can get involved in meaningful conversations, I find I really benefit from that. Whereas when I have a limited sort of vocabulary level and can only have very limited conversation, I find those lessons less beneficial. In fact, normally I won't do that until I have a level of vocabulary which would enable me to have a meaningful conversation that engages me. In that regard, I had the experience recently of spending 4 days during which I sort of stepped up my level of interaction with my Levantine Arabic. Instead of 1 hour a day, I was 3-4 hours a day listening and reading. And then I had an interaction. I had a lesson with my tutor, Samer, and we didn't go over any grammar or anything. We had a conversation about the Middle East, about World War I, World War II, history, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like a whole bunch of stuff I'd never done as well because I was interested in the subject. I had previously engaged with content on a variety of subjects, but I was able to speak with Samer, and I found that the vocabulary that I was able to bring up and recall wasn't limited to vocabulary that I had recently come across. In other words, that increased level of engagement, both with content and then with Samer on subjects of interest, all of a sudden caused a bunch of vocabulary to bubble to the surface that I was able to use in our conversation. So this brings me to the final point, and that is how a tutor or a teacher can be extremely influential in triggering and encouraging and fostering engagement. So it just so happens that Samer is an excellent tutor. He encourages me, he stimulates me. I want to do better for him. I want to engage with him. He has interesting things to say. I had the same experience with Sahra in learning Persian. And in fact, if I go back to the beginning of my interest in languages, it was because of a professor I had at McGill University, Maurice Rabotin, who stimulated my interest in French, the French language, French civilization, French culture, and that in turn led to me acquiring the confidence that I could learn languages and then taking that forward into learning so many other languages. So part of engagement can be a person. It doesn't have to be a teacher or a professor. It can be a relative, it can be a friend, but someone who spurs on and encourages and stimulates the level of engagement that we need in order to be successful in our language learning. So I hope that was useful. Thank you for listening.